Well, hello, Scott. Nice to see you, my friend.
Leighton, it's nice to see you. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome, awesome. We're really looking forward to today's show. And so, typically, what I'll do is, with a new guest, is ask them to introduce themselves, give us a backstory, and tell us how you got here.
Sure. I'm Scott Wilson, otherwise known as Gardener Scott. I've got the Gardener Scott YouTube channel and Instagram. It's all Gardener Scott. But I wasn't always Gardener Scott. I actually had a career in the U.S. Air Force as a pilot and was a command pilot running the airfield operations at the United States Air Force Academy. And after that kind of career, I was looking for something little less stressful and something to occupy my time in retirement, and kind of stumbled across the Master Gardener program. My family is not a family of gardeners, so I kind of dabbled in it a little bit as I was moving around the country in the Air Force. But I went to the Master Gardener program, was accepted, and went through all the training, and then started teaching classes for the Master Gardener program, and started doing public seminars and public classes. That was 20 years ago. And about 10 years ago, I started getting pretty serious about YouTube and essentially taking everything that I'd been doing in my classes and turning them into videos for YouTube. And in the last 20 years, I've become a gardener, and I've done just about every kind of gardening you can think of. I've got fruit trees and fruit bushes, and I've got my vegetable garden, I got my flower garden and my pollinator garden, and I've got the water to attract the wildlife. And primarily, I prefer raised bed gardening because I'm in Colorado and my soil is pretty bad in this part of the country. And so the choices are to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money to amend your terrible soil, or I prefer to go ahead and start with a raised bed and just create a good soil from the start in that particular bed for whatever type of plant I'm trying to grow. And so it's just a journey. Every year I'm doing something new and building a new part of the garden and growing different plants. And of course, making videos and appearing on live chats and podcasts and doing everything I can to just help spread the wonderful world of gardening.
Awesome. Well, I was hoping that you were going to say that because, like, I'm a big fan of like really addressing the whole ecosystem and not just like a garden, but
Mhm.
pollinators and water sources for the bees and hedgerows and as well as the edible stuff. So that's fantastic. So I mean, like you dove into this, but how did you get so far into it where you're almost like more of an ecosystem creator than just a gardener?
So I think gardening, and I've developed my own philosophy over the years, of course. I think gardening is an entire ecosystem. And about 10 years ago, I was hired to build a school garden here in Colorado Springs. It ended up being arguably the biggest school garden west of the Mississippi. More than 24,000 square feet, a 42-foot dome greenhouse. And we started with nothing. I mean, literally just bare dirt. It wasn't even soil at that point. And as I started working with the volunteers and working with the students and creating this huge space, even as a master gardener, I realized that I was overwhelmed by the task. And so I started doing more and more research and more experimentation to try to figure out how I could turn this barren space into a food source for the school districts, because that was really the intent. And in just a couple years, we were growing more than 2,000 pounds of produce a year. But what I saw as all this was developing, we started with raised beds, growing vegetables for food, and we had pest infestations and we had to deal with it. The philosophy of the garden was no chemicals of any type in the garden other than naturally occurring liquids and components in the soil. And so we dealt with pests, primarily the insect pests, the best we could. And at about the 3-year point, I noticed the pests just weren't appearing anymore. And at the fourth year, they were essentially gone. And it all came about as a result of growing ornamental grasses and trees and ground covers and having bird houses and bat houses and just creating an entire system that was what I call equilibrium. It was a balance between the pests and the predators. And all I had to do was just kind of keep it going, just give it a nudge here and there and harvest food that hadn't been eaten by insects or animals. And along the way, teaching the kids and teaching visitors and teaching the public about this overall concept that there is no single answer for gardening overall. Every garden is unique, but there are some basic tenets that if we follow, I think it can be really easy.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that one. Before we go too deep on that, Colorado Springs, are you on the west side of the Rockies or the east side?
The east side of the Rockies.
Okay, all right. And what elevation?
So my garden is just over 7,000 feet elevation.
And the school's garden, similar, right?
And the school's garden was at 6,500 foot elevation. Yeah.
Yeah, close enough. But definitely a challenge. I mean, you're
Oh,
in
yeah.
the dry, you're in the high UV, so
Yep.
yeah, I can see why you chose raised beds.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely. I mean, I love raised beds. Probably one of the biggest disadvantages for me is that raised beds have better drainage than the soil. And so in an environment like my east part of Colorado, the humidity is sometimes in single digits. The wind is blowing over the plains and the soil dries out extremely quickly in the raised beds. And so that's the biggest issue. But you overcome that, of course, by adding in the organic matter. So all those little sponges are holding on to the soil moisture and the mulching. And that's been part of the journey is trying these things and saying, wow, why do we have to water so often? And then realizing, oh, okay, yeah, it's because of my environmental conditions. And now I need to make some modifications to actually make my beds a little more productive. But it is challenging. My overall summer growing season is about 120 days, and we get down to I'm zone 5B, so minus 15 degrees pretty regularly in the winter. And then in the summer, it gets up to 100 degrees with winds. And then we've got thunderstorms that roll through in the afternoon and drop hail. I've gardened in half a dozen different states, and Colorado is easily the hardest place I've ever gardened.
Oh, I can appreciate that. I got my butt handed to me this spring. I'm making compost out here in Southern California, and the last two winters have been very wet, which is unusual for, I only got here 3 years ago. The first year was bone dry, and then we had rain both winters after that. So I wasn't fighting moisture at all. But boy, when the spring really hit and the heat hit up in Moore Park, and then the winds, and like you said, the dry humidity and the combination of winds, I lost a compost pile because I just couldn't
Oh,
keep it hydrated. And
yeah.
and I always believed that all the organisms would just cyst up and it would only just take some moisture to bring it back. But what I learned the hard way was that when that soil or that organic matter goes completely hydrophobic, no, everything is gone. So
Yeah.
that was the real challenge that I was caught off guard by. So I can totally appreciate what you're going through. Fortunately, we don't get hail.
You are
you know,
fortunate.
I would love some thunderstorms. I kind of miss that from coming back from East Coast, but the weather's kind of hard to beat. So there's a little bit of a trade off there.
Sure.
But yeah, so let's go back to the soil. So yeah,
Okay.
you're in one of those crusty, high clay, low drainage
Well,
soils.
and it's actually so Colorado Springs itself basically has 5 different soil types depending on which part of the town you're in. So one part of the town is high clay, but the other part of the town and to the east, so more where I'm at is actually high sand. So I have a sandy loam soil with a pretty high sand content, whereas closer to the mountains, they do tend to have clay. So even within our small region, we have quite a bit of disparity in what our soil types are.
Interesting. That's a new to me. I was just assuming that it would all be that mountain clay soils, but so you must be like in a valley or something.
No, quite the opposite. So all of the runoff, the erosion from the mountains that rolls into the foothills and then to the town of Colorado Springs and then also Denver, that tends to have that finer clay soil. I actually am now up in elevation on the way to Kansas, so it's kind of a high prairie. Um, Depending on how you define it, it's actually a high desert, and so we don't have that same erosion that the east or the west side of where I'm at is. And so it's sandy soil, higher altitude, kind of more of a plateau, very compacted soil, very nutrient deficient soil. And so it's like when the homesteaders were venturing west and coming to Kansas and Nebraska, and you've probably heard of how difficult it was to break the sod because the soil was just so dense, and that's kind of the region that I'm growing in.
So let's talk a little bit about your raised beds. What was your primary materials you were using?
And so I have raised beds of all different types now, but I began with just the basic 2x10 lumber that you buy at Lowe's or Home Depot and hammered them together into boxes and then filled it with soil and started growing. Since then, I've got galvanized steel beds that I've made. I've got the metal bed kits that I've constructed. I have stone beds. I've got concrete block beds. And so, depending on what I'm growing, I actually use different types of raised beds for different types of plants.
Very smart. So when you finish the construction of the frame, is your go-to like a potting soil, or is it a soil that you blend yourself?
No,
Oh,
it's almost always been a soil that I blend myself. I like to be a frugal gardener. And so I've got leaves, I've got grass, I've got weeds, I've got, organic matter that's around. And so I like to just incorporate as much of my own naturally occurring organic matter into my terrible soil. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. I also practice variations of hugelkultur. And so in my raised beds, and I've got a video, it's about 5 years old now, that shows the process I use burying the logs. And now it seems like everybody's doing logs, but I was doing it years ago. And that helps build the soil. But the way I look at it is that's building the soil from the bottom of the bed. And it takes years for those logs to break down, for all that organic matter that's incorporated into the terrible soil actually does anything. And so for the top portion, when starting a garden, will buy soil in bulk that already has some amendments worked into it. And if you can find a nice uh, rock yard, they can actually give you your own custom blend of topsoil and humus and compost and whatever you happen to have. And so I use that for about half of the fill when I'm creating a new raised bed. And when I'm talking raised beds for like the vegetable garden, they're 16 to 18 inches high. And then the top portion gets back to my own recipes of compost and hopefully my own compost, leaf mold, worm castings. It's just too expensive to put worm castings throughout the whole bed. And you really don't need worm castings throughout the whole bed. And so it's just that top portion that I'll get back into creating some of my own custom blends. And honestly, every bed is different. I follow different recipes depending on what I have available when I'm filling that bed. So some beds have more leaves and other beds have more grass, and some beds have more biochar and some beds have more worm castings. And then I just tweak it every year. I let the plants tell me how good the soil is,
Mhm.
and if the soil needs any improvement, then I'll add something to those respective beds.
No, and they will tell you.
Yes.
Plant whispering is one of my favorite things to do.
Yes. Good. Yes.
So you said you make your own compost. So tell us a little bit more about how your composting process. 'Cause
And
everybody,
so, unlike you, I don't take the effort to try to have a hot pile. So I do lazy composting because it is such a challenge, as you've discovered, to keep a pile moist when you live in an area that has very low humidity and high winds and high temperatures. And so I basically just stack everything, and I try to do an initial green and brown layering system, and I just let nature break it down. Now, it takes 12 to 18 months sometimes for that to break down. And I make leaf mold where I just do the same thing with just big piles of leaves and allow it to break down over the course of a year and a half or so. Uh, it can be done, I know that, and I could spend all the effort to get a hot pile and maintain it at 160 degrees and have compost much faster, but I've got a lot of other stuff going on in the garden, and I work a lot with nature, and nature will break down the materials. And then in fact, I've actually been digging it up this week. Have done lasagna gardening beds. So I'll dig out a bed and then layer in all that organic matter. And I did that about a year and a half ago. And now I'm digging out all of that wonderful soil that has broken down and adding that to other beds and other areas of the garden. So luckily I've got about half an acre, and about half of that is devoted to my pollinator garden and fruit garden and vegetable garden. And so I have enough space that I can just pile heaps of organic matter and let it break down.
that's awesome. I love the philosophy of just letting nature do its thing. And to be honest with you, I'm not a hot compost guy. I
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So what I typically do is I take in here at Peach Hill in Southern California, I'm upcycling all this material, organic material that's coming in. So it's already gone thermophilic for the most cases, or it's been pasteurized, like in the case of the organic vertical farm in LA or the mushroom
okay.
compost or mushroom block guys. So I don't have to worry about pathogens per se. So my goal is to get a pile, and I have to kick the heat out of it. So it's a turning process in the beginning,
Hmm.
because even though the ratios of browns to greens, well,
Hmm.
sometimes the browns are heavier in nitrogen, and
Oh, yeah.
sometimes the greens are more heavier in carbon. So you can't. There's no like, oh, this percentage is perfect for all plants. So a lot of it is trial and error. So when I make the perfect pile, I never have to touch it. But
Right.
that's only happened a few times. The rest of the time, it's like, oh, I could see it spiking up, and I don't want to get it to 130 because at 130 you start to lose your diversity.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why I like the lazy composting or
Cool
cool
compost.
composting.
Yeah,
Uh,
cold
it-
composting.
yeah, because I'm not losing nitrogen to the air,
Right. Right.
and and I'm encouraging the earthworms to come in, and along with the arthropods and everything else to actually have a home in my pile, and they do a bulk of the work as well.
Mhm. Oh, those shredders are amazing at breaking down organic matter. I got a pile now going at Peach Hill where I've got probably 6 toads, a
Nice.
couple of mice. You flip back the cover, and there's so many different types of arthropods. And I attribute that to why I've got such a high toad population, is that there's just so
Oh, I
much
bet.
food and moisture. So this is a technique that you might find very interesting. When I was back in New England, I made what I would call a lazy man's compost. Basically, what you're talking about. It's cold. So what I would do is I would get an old rotten log out of the woods, drag it out, and then I would put branches back and forth to make a teepee. And the branches were,
Okay.
little tiny, maybe half inch max diameter, with the leaves on them, so deciduous. and
Okay.
I'd layer them back and forth, kind of like a broom, and then I'd put 3 inches of hay down and then build my compost pile.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So what that did was when I put the log down, I would soak it. So that was my moisture supply for the whole season.
Almost like a wicking bed, but the log was producing that
Yeah.
perpetual moisture.
Right. So normally I'd actually spray it with a compost extract along with water, and then constantly watering as I'm building the pile too, so that I had a good reservoir or banking of
Nice.
water. And the nice part about this style of compost was that it's a convection oven. So it pulls cool air through the bottom in that tent and helps to mitigate the heat and get it out of the top. And so I
Interesting.
could very quickly just plant the pile. And that's what I would do is once I got the temperature to 110 or less, which normally was right out of the gate,
Mhm.
I would get some cover crop of some green manures, flowers. I pick a bunch of little saplings and shrubs. I throw a bunch of acorns on top of it because the acorns really love that heat and that
Interesting.
moisture, and they would all pop. So I had like you couldn't even tell that it was a compost pile. They looked more like a Paul Bunyan grave, which is a term where you build a berm and then plant it
Mhm.
with all these ornamentals. And oh my God, the compost was absolutely amazing. I do
That's
a
great.
pile in spring and a pile in fall, so I always had a fresh stock of compost to work with. And I mean, talk about like easy peasy. I mean, do you own a microscope?
Um, I yes and no. I had one, but I gave it to my grandson, so I actually don't have one right now. But and I know you're very aware of Dr. Elaine Ingham, and
Yeah.
so as I watch her videos and some of her instruction, it's like I really need to get a microscope and really spend more time seeing what's happening in my soil.
Oh, dude, I would kill to get some of your soil because just what you're telling me in your techniques, your methods, your overall understanding that yeah, you're building an ecosystem, not just a perhaps a garden, right?
Yeah,
You're doing it all. So I'll bet you've
absolutely.
got just nematodes out the yin yang, especially in the leaf mold.
Oh
They
yeah. Well, and the leaf mold is actually pretty interesting. I was actually just digging in it today. So initially, yes, you can actually see the life that's in it, and then I put it into a 55-gallon trash can with a lid, and just let it sit, and it continued to break down, and basically, any organisms that were there are now pulverized. Everything is just this really fine leaf powder throughout and so I was looking at because now I need to add that to some of my beds as well. But you can see this photo was taken a couple of weeks ago in my garden. I don't use any fertilizer at all. Absolutely no fertilizer. And I've got the big green bushy plants that grow fast and produce well, and I occasionally do soil tests, and one of my beds was actually a little bit too high in some of the nutrients, so I had to cut back the next year and some of the organic material I was adding. But that it's doable. I I'll give you some of my bad soil in exchange for some of your native soil that I'm sure is a lot better than mine.
All right, we're going to be soil trading buddies after this. I'll send you some compost too.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm actually just about ready to go to market on a new product that's going to be
Oh,
probably 2/3 compost, 1/3 worm castings, which I'm producing here, blended together and then spritzed with fish brew, which is a wonderful aquatic microorganism
okay.
extract. And I get such great results with it. And I
Nice.
used to make this product called Rejuvenate, which I sold to, publicly, but it was just so much energy, so much labor to put that product together, and cost is a factor, especially
Yeah.
nowadays. So I wanted to try to figure out a better way to make a product that was more cost effective for the masses, but still provided that high level of inoculation. And I'm going to recommend people add it to water, agitate it as much as they can for 24
Okay.
hours, and then apply it. There's been some really great studies coming out of your area, actually. Lynn Cartufa did one on dissolved organic matter, which started as dissolved organic carbon, but that never really caught on. And I think the dissolved organic matter is a better way to explain it. But it's essentially you're making root exudates. And
Hmm.
when you apply them, now the plant doesn't have to burn its ABT or ADP to create the energy to throw the roots, to feed the microorganisms, because you're doing it. And so as a
Yeah,
result, you get much bigger yields, much bigger vegetative growth, and less roots, which was, really kind of interesting.
interesting.
And yeah, it was really interesting to see this and figure this all out. And I think Dr. James White was the guy that really put the nail on the
Okay.
head by saying, what you're doing is you're growing what we call the little feeder roots.
Yeah. And that's an interesting idea because if you could inoculate or basically give the plant a head start, because even as much time as I've spent building my soils, growing my plants, it still takes time, and I can see the improvement. In the first year the plants do okay, in the second year they do better, in the third year they do better still. And so if you can like knock off a year of soil development by being able to inoculate or add some of a liquid organic matter to the soil, that's an intriguing idea.
Well, I'll make sure I get you some of it. You can play with
Okay.
it
Oh,
because you'll love it. I mean, you could literally gain a couple years by doing it.
well, and I saw when I was at the school garden, I did a number of different types of testing, and I was working with a biochar company, a local company making biochar, and inoculation of all types is important. I'm not a huge fan of buying an inoculant that might not be native to your area or won't survive in your area, but the biochar in particular, the beds that I put uh, non-inoculated biochar did terrible
Of
in the
course,
first year.
of course it
And
is.
of course, the ones that were inoculated did wonderfully. And
Yeah.
so in the second year, they were equal. It
Mhm.
just takes a year for everything in the soil to just build up to speed to be able to start growing. So
And I,
um,
I love that you've had an experience that I've been preaching about for years. Is like, no, don't buy straight biochar. If
yeah,
you are, you got to put it in your compost pile first, because otherwise, the microbes are going to disassociate with the plant. They got party time over there. I'm like,
yeah.
why
And
would they?
and that was, and I'm sure you've seen some similar research that discusses some of how the biochar works, but my determination was they were sucking the nutrients out of the soil for themselves, for biochar, as though it's a living organism, what it's not, but at the expense of the plants. And so the plants are trying to feed, and the biochar is stolen everything.
Literally steals it. It's both the cation exchange as well as the microbes.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's one of the powers of uninoculated biochar. If you're doing bioremediation, trying to clean something up, there's your best friend in a nutshell right there. But if you're trying to grow something with it, no, it's got to be inoculated.
yeah.
So let's go back and talk a little bit more about the leaf mold. So you didn't add any water to it; you just let it just bake all the way
Um,
to dust.
So during the summer, just because it's so hot and dry, and my environment is such that if you don't add water, then the decomposition will never happen. And so you could have a pile of leaves for 3 or 4 years, and it'll still be the same pile of leaves, broken down mildly. I get less than 18 inches total precipitation each
Wow,
year,
you
and
are
that includes all of the snow we get during the winter, which basically does nothing for the soil. So, as far as moisturizing it and helping with decomposition, because I am also so cold in winter, so it's very small amount of water that's actually working toward decomposition. And so I had a column made with welded fence wire that I had my leaves in. And like my compost pile, when I am trying to generate some heat, I would water the leaves, and then once winter set in, just let it go and let the natural snow deal with it. And some decomposition did happen in the winter, but then once the spring started up again, I was watering, and I had my leaf mold piles right next to the garden. So when I was out gardening, I could just turn over and spray the leaf mold to try to keep it relatively moist.
So this is a great lesson I learned back at my days of Rodale, was that when I was collecting leaf mold from the woods or the local what do we call undeveloped areas, I would always go to a blowdown, a tree that had blown down, or an old
Hmm.
stone wall, and I would collect the leaves on the opposite side of the prevailing wind. And the prevailing wind would just constantly blow the leaves up over the top of whatever the barrier was, and then deposit them on the back side. And when I pulled those up, they were soaking wet. Like at the bottom, it was just this gorgeous
I
humus,
bet.
right? And so that might be a trick for you too, is that when you are making your leaf molds, figure out where the prevailing wind is, and then just pile them behind your raised beds, so that way during the winter,
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
yeah,
I,
yeah, and then just shovel them on the spring.
okay.
Um,
I'm
so
always looking for a new challenge. I like it.
well, I got lots of them, including myself. But yeah, once I would microscope that stuff, oh, you talk about nematode haven.
Oh yeah.
They just love that stuff, the leaf mold. So that might be a good trick for you to
Okay.
boost your biology a little bit more as well.
Cool.
So that's interesting. But you basically ended up with just like almost like a humic acid in a powderized form.
Yeah, basically, and most of that happened after I put it into the sealed garbage can, and so I didn't take a lot of effort in crushing the leaves. I crushed some of the leaves. I kept some of the leaves whole in the initial pile, and then when I harvested it, it was mostly broken down, but there were some identifiable pieces of leaf that were in the mold. And then when I put it into the sealed environment of that garbage can, and the moisture, in fact, it's I opened, like I said, I opened it today, and it's still moist inside, and that enabled everything else to continue to break down. And there's nothing identifiable as a leaf at this point. And it really it's not a powder, it's more granular, but compared to the way it was, it's pretty incredible.
All right, I need a sample of that to microscope too.
Okay. Yeah.
So primarily these deciduous leaves or just garden leaves? Everything from
Primarily deciduous. So I I don't have any trees on my property other than my fruit trees right now. I've got a couple willow trees, but they don't have a huge amount of leaves. Both of them almost died, and so I sought out bags of leaves from people who were willing to share, and it was all deciduous leaves of the different varieties that grow here in Colorado, of different sizes.
wow. So you can actually go collect the big paper trash bags full of leaves.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't even do much in the way of collection. I had a gardener friend, Frank, who knew I was going to be doing this, and he was working with the city parks to help clean up some of uh, the the fallen leaves in the parks, and so he had dozens and dozens of bags of leaves. So I just drove over. I think I got 12 or 15 bags, and then brought them back and used them as mulch on my beds, used them to make leaf mold, used it as the browns in my compost pile. And I basically always try to have some bags of dried leaves at any given time. I got bags of dried leaves right now, to use however I choose. And we haven't had any dried leaves in 10 months. So I think that's just one of those things that gardeners should have in their toolbox, is just bags of leaves for whatever they want to use them for.
Oh, agreed, 100%. And what people don't realize is those leaves contain a tremendous amount of endophytic biology, both
Oh,
fungally
sure.
as well as the bacteria. So
Well, and
they're
there's a mineral component that the leaves have that you won't get in compost. And so, I some of my favorite mulch is rough compost that still has some good chunks in it, mixed with crushed leaves and dried grass clippings, and I equate it all to like a pizza. If you just mulch with one thing or amend your soil with one thing, it's like eating a cheese pizza. It's good, but it could be better. And so when you mix all this different stuff together, like you're talking about, it just adds so much of abundance of life, and it becomes a pizza with everything.
Mhm.
And it's the olives and the onions and the mushrooms and the pepperoni and everything all at once, because you've got so much variety that you're adding to the top or interior of the soil.
Yeah, it's all about the diversity.
Yeah.
You can't get enough. And that's something that I preach a lot to people about compost making is like, don't just get, woods, grounds, and greens. Go out and find things that call to you, that look pretty, or
Yeah.
they look unique, whether it's flowers or a broken branch or whatever. I mean, you can't get enough diversity. And let's face it, I mean, even if it doesn't become a colonizer, it's still a food source. It's still a
Oh, yeah.
biostimulant for your people, your guys that are, that are colonizing or more, how should I say, suitable to your environment. But even still, then you go down the rabbit hole of like, horizontal gene transfer and some of these other, biological transfers, and they're sharing information and they're strengthening each other. So as a whole, you're getting a bigger village with more diversity and more abilities and more talents. So I know
Yeah.
I love what you're doing. I mean, that
Oh,
was the
thanks.
one thing that was crazy back east was all these people would you go around in fall and there'd just be bags and bags and bags of leaves everywhere. And I'd be like, why aren't you putting those right in the edge of your woods? Why
That's
would you
right.
take them away?
That's right.
It's crazy. And you know, the other thing is that as the regenerative needle moves in both the landscaping industry as well as the farming and ag industry, those kinds of resources. I mean, how hard would it be for them to just build those, like a 6x6 welded wire, we call them bioreactor
Yeah.
cages, and
Yeah.
just fill it up in the fall, and then in the spring you got that for all of the flowers and the
Yeah.
trees around the rest of the park, and it's not like it's an eyesore, and it's not going to blow away.
Yeah. It's an awareness issue. It's just one of those things that everybody could do it. And if everybody knew the benefits of it, maybe everyone would do it.
Mm.
But there's just a lack of awareness. And it's easier just to put your bag on the curb and have the trash man throw it in a landfill somewhere.
And at the end of the day, that's not a bad thing either. The landfill needs all the love it can get. So if it
Yes,
can get
that's
some
true.
love,
Adding organic matter to the landfill is not necessarily a bad thing.
right. And I struggle with that. Like we have a lot of municipal compost. Where I am is like this belt, this green belt from San Diego all the way up to right up the West Coast. Everything that's west of that first mountain divide produces a lot of green
Yeah.
materials. And unfortunately, like you said, awareness, education, people don't understand the value of that material if they just put it back in their own soil versus throwing it in the green bin and shooting it off to be municipally composted. And it broke my heart when I first got here. And I was
Yeah.
watching these people fill these green barrels full of biomass. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Anyway, then you go to the compost yards and it's this ammonia stinky compost that's either completely anaerobic or hydrophobic and smells like ammonia. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? Because if you try to put that on a plant, you're going to kill it.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And then the people that put it on the plant and kill it, they go back to the plant guy at Home Depot or Lowe's and complain, you gave me a bad plant. Well, no, you put the wrong stuff on
Yeah.
top. And how do you bring that awareness around it? It's an incredible challenge that, hey,
It is. It
if
is. That's a big reason why I make YouTube videos. When I was uh, doing the school garden 10 years ago and doing all that research that I had mentioned earlier, I just saw so much information on YouTube that was at best incomplete, but at worst just completely inaccurate. And it's like I have to do something about that, and that's what actually got me started as a YouTube creator with a mission, was to start making as many videos as I could to try to make that awareness on all types of different issues. And and it makes a difference. You know numbers of people who tell me that their garden is better because of the Gardner Scott channel. Of course, that's what I live for, because now, like when we began our discussion, that's something that can be carried forward to everybody else, and they don't have to do it my way. I really don't have a Gardner Scott way of doing things. It's a philosophy that you do the research, you do the experimentation, you learn more about what you're doing, and then you spread the word to create that awareness so that others can do the same thing.
Oh, I love when people copy. It's the best compliment in the world. And quite honestly, that's why I started podcasting. It might be 7 years ago now. Was to get rid of the bro science, and this
Yeah,
it started in the cannabis space because I'd been through a lot of travels, like from national parks, huge monster restoration projects, super high end real estate developments, and basically got burned out because
sure.
after I'd get done getting that soil to perfection, and I'd hand the keys over to whoever, whether it was a municipality or a state government office, didn't matter. The next thing you know, the guys would roll in with a blue green shit. And it was like,
Yeah,
why did I just spend all this time doing this work? And
yeah,
so I burned out on that whole industry after about, I don't know, 10 years of doing it. And then was invited into the cannabis space, as a soil biologist and an engineer. And what I learned very quickly was people that grow cannabis love their plants. Like they're all
yeah,
about their plants, right?
yeah.
Whereas
And
landscapers, they just want to cut, mow, and blow and fertilize. So they have to cut, mow, and blow more.
and they have an awareness of the soil's impact on the plant and the buds and every other aspect of a plant's growth. It ultimately comes down to the soil. And so you can, yeah, I completely agree. Some of the most amazing gardeners I know are in the cannabis world, and it's modifying the soils to get the different results. And it really is more of an awareness, but not enough, of course.
No, but in many ways, like as cannabis got legalized, there was more and more pressure on ag to start saying, well, how are these hippies growing this plant without any fertilizers?
Yeah,
How are they doing this? Because we try to do that, we can't grow a thing. And it's like, yeah, right, because you don't bring in the ecosystem, you don't care about the soil. So in many ways, that has brought a lot more awareness of, hey, what are we doing to the soil, and
hmm,
how are we, are we making it better, or are we just sustaining our dirt, or are we regenerating it? Are we improving the system? And so in many ways, I still hope that that cannabis as a whole spreads the word to the ag producers that yeah, there is a better way, and
yeah,
through awareness and love of the plant. And
yeah.
unfortunately, when you're mass producing plants, there's no love there. It's a job, right? You're out there working your tail off to try to bring in a crop and hopefully make a profit. Whereas stuff like what you're doing is you're way more connected to the environment. You're not
Yeah.
just running around on a tractor 12 hours a day.
Well, and I'm proud to say I'm a lazy gardener. I don't want to work hard, and I don't want to be out all day getting hot and sweaty and worn out. And I recognize how easy it is if you spend the time learning and creating that system and then putting it into place. And sure, I mean, I spent, it would take me, I could do 2 beds in a day. So when I was building and filling the raised beds, um, it would take a day to fill the 2 beds because I'm mixing different ingredients as I'm filling the bed, and I'm going to different areas of the yard to get different materials. And then, of course, I'm spending more time to get that population within the soil growing. And then, of course, there's I'm usually doing an annual amending now. So if you look at only that part of it, it's a lot of work. But when you step back and say, okay, so wait a minute, you did a grand total of 2 days to get that bed up and running, and now you've got great soil, and you can just sit back and let the plant do all the work. It's like, no, it really isn't that hard to get something like this going.
Oh, I love it. And it's not the lazy man's way. It's nature's way.
Yeah,
Let's face it,
exactly.
nature's as lazy as the day is long. And she knows, and that's the problem with humanity is we look at it like in human time instead of geological time. Because, an hour a day, a week is a joke in the big scale of like how soil is actually formed. So
Yeah,
I think that's the other side of the coin is like making more people understand that yeah, it might be some work in the front side, but
yeah.
if you've done it right, you put in enough intention and love, diversity, and a little bit of watering, yeah, it'll take care of itself, and then all you really have to do is pick.
I'm doing
Harvest.
something you might be interested in my front yard. So I initially started with terrible soil. Like I said, I did bring in some soil, put up some small retaining walls, put in a lot of native plants and mulch, and in about half of my front yard, did nothing. The soil was absolutely terrible, and so I'm about 3 years into this experiment, and did a lot of work this week. And so I think my neighbors uh, during different times of the year are not happy with me because I just let anything grow in that space. And so, it's the basic philosophy of like the pioneer plants, where you have the different plants that come in. Weeds is what we typically call them. And as the soil improves, different types of plants move in and help improve the soil. And that's what I'm doing in half of my front yard, is just letting nature build the soil. And when the weeds get a little bit too tall, I chop them down. So now I've got organic mulch on top of this terrible soil. And next year, I'll actually start digging in it and putting some plants in it. And it's not much work, but it's so interesting to see, especially after doing some research and reading on how different plants move in to improve the soil, and actually see it happen in almost real time, to see the different weeds that were there 3 years ago from the weeds that are actually appearing right now. And yeah, I got to get a microscope to also take a look at what's happening with the soil organisms underneath it as well. But it's it's not always pretty, and it is one of those things that may not necessarily look like the traditional garden, but you can build your own soil in so many different ways. And I say you build it, but basically you allow nature to build the soil.
You know, I hate the term weeds like you. I like to call them indicator plants.
Yeah,
And you're right, because they're indicating a lack of certain type of nutrition, and they're willing to uptake as much as they can, sacrifice themselves, die, leave the organic matter on the surface for the next succession to come in. And
yeah,
it is truly amazing when you see, like you said, especially over a few years when you really don't do anything. Like, yeah, you throw down some chips and just let it go, right?
yeah,
How effective it is at transitioning this dirt into soil.
yeah.
And so, one of the things that I started to introduce to landscape architects back when I was doing these, $4.5 million landscapes, was I was like, they'd have like, miles of lawn. And I'm like, hey, you know what, guys, let's try this. Give me, maybe a half an acre. And we're not going to plant it with grass. We're going to plant it with a meadow mix. and we're going to have what's called a high mow meadow. And what's going to happen is you're going to mow paths through this, walkways, put some benches, bird houses, but you're going to let it grow to flower, and then you're going to high mow it, chop and
Yeah.
drop. And then another flush will come in the fall before the winter. So you'll get actually two different unique seasons out of this area that you're allowing to rewild. And so one of them took the chance, which, is kind of unusual with those guys. They're very, I do it my way. And his client came back to him and was like, you got to come out here and look at this. Like, the whole meadow is moving. There's so many different insects and birds and life that have come into this property. Right. And that's essentially kind of what you're doing, is you're letting the nature come back into it, which is only going to benefit everything around you.
Yeah.
Like, this one neighbor had, I think it was like 10 acres of land in New Canaan, Connecticut, which was, talk about money. Her neighbor started coming over to her and saying, we're seeing a lot more birds and butterflies and, all these really cool insects around our property. We think it's because of your meadow. Is that possible? And those, so she got all excited because now she's the local hero in the neighborhood. And now everybody else has started doing it. Even if they're not doing, huge plots, they're still doing like a little corner somewhere, like pollinator gardens, like, hedging and some of these other techniques that helps nature come in. There's nothing better than a nice, diverse hedgerow for birds to come in and nest.
Yeah.
There's just so many benefits to it. So I love what you're doing on the front yard. To hell with the neighbors.
Well, exactly. And it's the kind of neighborhood that we don't have sidewalks, we don't have street lights, it's outside of town. And so it's relatively quiet, and there's nobody that complains about anybody else. So I can get away with it. I don't have an HOA that I have to fight with to make my soil better.
Those HOAs have got to be, the power has to be taken away from those people. They're just making a mess all over the place. Everywhere I deal with a client with an HOA, I'm like, oh man, you're screwed. You can't put a fruit tree in. Wait, what? You have to put this expensive, high maintenance watering nightmare.
Yeah.
Come on, people, like, wake up. So yeah, I guess in many ways you are blessed that you don't have that back push from everybody.
Yeah.
And hey, let's face it, nature is kind of messy. She's not like us. She's not groomed all the time.
That's right.
So let her be, right?
That's right. Yeah, don't upset her. If you try to tell her what she's supposed to look like, she'll get mad.
Oh, she'll send in waves of pests and toads flying out of the sky.
It's interesting this year. So in my part of Colorado, and did a garden tour with my local gardening club that I'm a member of. And so gardeners get together, we go to different gardens of our club. We're all talking about the problems we have. That's what gardeners do, of course. When you get together, you complain about what's not working. And there's been some big grasshopper infestations in my area. And everybody was talking about the plants they lost to grasshoppers, how they were battling these grasshoppers. And of course, to some of my friends, I would on the side say, I don't have a grasshopper problem. And, I literally can count on one hand the number of grasshoppers that I grabbed off a leaf and killed. But, there's a number of reasons for it. Part of it is the birds and the wildlife and the predators that I've got. Another part of it is the life cycle of the insects. I actually was later putting my plants in the ground this year. And so I missed the grasshopper laying cycle, egg laying cycle. And so, tying it back to the concept of soil, of course, I have very, very few pests of any type, soil pests, airborne pests, because I try to modify my plantings to whatever the pest might be, and to actually put my plants in the ground to avoid whatever problem might emerge later on. And it's work, relatively speaking. But again, that's kind of the lazy gardener philosophy, is I don't want to have to deal with all of those pests. If I just spend a little bit of effort up front and allow Mother Nature to work with me with all those natural predators, but also learn from Mother Nature as to what the life cycle is and use that to my benefit as well.
Smart gardening.
Exactly. Yeah, lazy gardening really is smart gardening. It just sounds better when you say it's lazy gardening.
Right. Well, you attract more attention. You mean I can do this and I don't have to work that hard?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a video I did. I think I did it last year where I talked about lazy gardening, and that was the message: is to be a lazy gardener, you've got to do research, you've got to learn, and you've got to do some initial effort, and then you can sit back.
Mhm.
And so ultimately, it's being smart with your gardening so that you don't have to work hard.
So, do you utilize banker plants and trap plants?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I was at the school garden, I told you after a period of years we didn't have any of the pests, but one of the things I noticed, particularly with the turnips, that one year I was growing turnips, and the turnips were just uh, inundated with insect pests, and nothing else around it was. And so then when I moved to the house, I've been at this house for 5 years now, and it is 6 years ago that I retired from the Galileo Garden. I started using trap crops for the same thing, and I began by using turnips as a trap crop in my garden as a way to deal with some of the pests that I had seen in other gardens that I had. And, whether it was pirate bugs or harlequin bugs or some of the other, infestations I've had over the years, uh, the trap crop really worked out well. And so you understanding, so I have another plant, and it's more of the magnet plant. Every year it's uh, a I think it's a native plant. I'm not sure it's a native plant. It was there when I moved in, but it's a currant. And so I don't know that currants are native to this part of Colorado, but I see this plant growing almost everywhere. It's the first plant every year to have aphids on it. And every year it's usually covered with aphids. And about 5 days later, it's covered with ladybugs. And so I encourage that plant. It's growing in an area that is is harsh, and it stresses the plant, which is why it's the first one being attacked, because it doesn't get enough sun, doesn't get enough water, and so the aphids attack that plant. And then I put in the rest of my garden with the ladybugs already in place to deal with the aphids. I haven't had an aphid problem in my garden. I can't tell you how long it's been since I've even seen much in the way of an aphid. And in my overall garden, in my greenhouse this year, I had aphids. And one day I looked, and it's like, what's all those little white things on that plant? And I got down a little closer, and I realized it was the exoskeleton of all these aphids, and underneath the leaves were the ladybug larvae that had appeared inside my greenhouse to deal with the aphids. And so when you allow nature to work, whether it's inside your greenhouse or outside, and you have that balance of plants to focus the pests if it's a pest problem, or to attract the predators that are reacting to pests. Oh yeah, I absolutely use those kind of plants to my benefit throughout my garden.
That's a great story of, and I wouldn't call that a banker or a trap, because in many ways it's both, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it attracted the pests, which attracted the predator, and then the
Absolutely.
predator's hanging out now, and it's going to hang out as long as there's any food there, and then it's going to move on to your neighbors or whoever else in the neighborhood has that problem. So you're benefiting yourself as well as the people around you. So that's fantastic.
And it
Yeah,
works. It really does work.
it works great. I had a client who had a cannabis grow up in Humboldt, and they had a real deer problem. Like they did a double, like 8 foot or 9 foot tall deer fence with just a small, like 7 foot gap in between, thinking that the deer would get over the first one and get hit the second one.
Yeah.
Well, the deer went over both of them, like just nothing. And it got into their garden and destroyed it. And I'm like, why aren't you growing cannabis outside the freaking fence? So you're feeding nature. Give them something to be chewing on so that they don't have to go to the trouble. Like if you gave it to them, they're not going to jump over the fence.
Yeah.
They're going to be more than happy with you providing them with the food that they don't have to work for. And lo and
Yeah.
behold, work like a charm. And those are
I'm
the things you can do, outside of your garden, or you can suggest it to a neighbor, or find an area
it's
that doesn't
easy.
grow very well, right? It's so easy.
Yeah, I'm a big believer. I call them sacrificial plants because that's
Yeah,
what they are. You
yeah,
are growing them intentionally for the animals, so the animals don't bother all those other plants that you want to do. And the same with the pests that could become a problem. I've got deer, I've got squirrels, I've got raccoons, all that kind of stuff, and I've got Mala who's popping her head up
yeah.
here. She
There
does
you
a
go.
good job trying to deal with some of them. She brought me a nice mouse last night, uh, but the idea being that you you go ahead and feed those pests, and then they're not pests anymore. My brother and sister-in-law have squirrel feeders on their fence, and the squirrels eat from the squirrel feeders and don't venture into the garden and eat anything in the garden. And the deer, I don't have enough because my fences are low and they come in through the neighbors' yards. But I do as much as I can, putting some plants around the periphery that the deer will find, and hopefully Mala at that point will realize there's a deer in the backyard and she'll run out and try to chase them away. But it, it's effort. Again, it's that smart gardening idea that deals with a pest that you would otherwise, look at how much effort people spend on trying to get rid of the deer by buying the sound or the chemical or whatever it is that they think is going to scare away the deer, and has minimal effort.
Yep. No, I was a big proponent of early on is these scent traps. So
Mhm.
I would mix garlic. It was a combination of three plants: garlic, cedar oil, and something else. And you basically take an old soda bottle or a water bottle, and you fill it all the way up, and then you poke some holes at the top. And as it heats up during the day, it expands, and it builds up like the odor inside of it. And
Mhm.
as it cools, the odor comes out. And that was a great way to prevent them from coming in while we were building the landscape, because we were setting up a buffet for these guys. Like every day, there'd be all these fresh new plants ready to go, and but
Yeah.
they were loving it, right? Well, yeah, they were loving it, but we weren't. We're trying to get the job done and satisfy the clients. So, out of desperation, I came up with this, like, all right, let's go with nature's way of deterrence, so that we're not like you said, spraying harsh chemicals. That goes against everything I believe. So there are plenty of tricks out there for people that do have specific pest problems.
Yeah.
Some of these bigger pests, whether it's raccoons, squirrels, or deer, that you can do like your neighbor did with the
Yeah.
squirrel feeders. It's a great idea. Great idea. So
And-
I'm a big fan of getting creative in these
oh yeah.
situations.
Yeah. Yeah. Too often there's an idea that somebody says is a good idea, and then it gets passed around and everybody else passes it even further, and nobody even stops to question whether it actually works or not. And so often they don't work, but it's the thing everybody tries.
It's funny how that works, right? The thing that works, they don't try, but the one that doesn't work, they do.
Yeah.
I get a little bit of that in my life from time to time as well.
Yeah.
But you got to just smile. Hey, look, they tried something, and some of them might try another thing later, or some might just say, all right, this hokey pokey natural biology thing doesn't work. But if, like you said, if you get your garden chugging along on all 8 cylinders, with healthy biology, diversity in bugs, diversity in predators, birds, and all of these things, yeah, you're going to avoid
Yeah.
95% of any kind of pest pressure. And if you do get any pest pressure, it's probably because maybe that plant wasn't healthy enough for your consumption anyway.
Yeah, and like we were saying earlier, the plants are talking to you, and so if you start having a pest issue and it's only on one plant or it's localized, now you can say, "Oh, okay, it's that plant telling me that it is weak or it's struggling or it's diseased or there was a particular stress." And so the insects along with the plant can highlight that maybe you've got a bigger issue that you need to deal with if you just pay attention to it. I had that a couple years ago. I was doing an experiment with different ways that I had planted tomato plants, how deep I was planting the the transplant to when I put it out into the garden. And I noticed one of the plants that just wasn't growing as well. And it did start getting some pests that none of the other plants were getting. And so I listened and I pulled that plant. And it ended up being a tomato disease that nipped in the bud. Nothing else was infected. The rest of the garden did great. But by paying attention to every plant in the garden, you can get to that point that you recognize something's not right
Mhm.
and then take appropriate action.
No, I love that, and that's a great story, a great example of the farmer's shadow, being
Yeah.
in the garden, being present, being mindful. In science, observation is 50% of the job, and most scientists don't understand it, or I should say, in the natural sciences.
Yeah.
That is they're not you're not wasting time walking around the garden in bare feet just marveling at nature. You're actually being a part of the system. You're a member of that ecosystem, and you're doing your job as the steward to make
Yep.
sure that you are protecting your family, your the next generation.
Exactly.
So no, that's a great example of how the powerful observation can be, and then gives you the insight and gives you the actions to take care of
Yeah.
something that could have turned into a nightmare.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So before we get too crazy, I want to talk more about fruit trees. So are you doing like what we would call preparation? So planting for long-term growth, or are you doing grove style? I mean, I've worked with a lot of different architects and permaculture people, and there's different styles. So
Okay.
what is your style for fruit tree?
For fruit trees
Yeah,
specifically.
yeah, specifically.
So I am following a basic guild system with my fruit trees. And so at the same time, I'm confronting my terrible soil. And so I I actually developed a plan 5 years ago of what my garden was going to look like and identified where the fruit trees, the little mini orchard would be, and started putting those trees in 4 years ago. But one of the first things I did was about 6 to 8 inches of wood chip mulch in that area, and then put the fruit trees in because they were going to take the longest. And since then, I've put in different fruit bushes, josta berry, gooseberry, all types of different plants. I've got some raspberries that are on the backside. So the basic philosophy is kind of like the rest of my garden: diversity, filling up a space, putting in a number of different plants, but I'm taking it a step at a time. So it started with the trees that went in. Then the next year, I put in the fruit trees. Then I started putting in some peripheral, smaller plants. Next year, I plan to put in some flowering, perennial and predatory insect attractors, and it's a long term. So to your question, it's a long term project that I'm taking to get these fruit trees uh, into a complete space that will uh, give me, I've got 6 different cider apples. And so I want to make my own hard cider. So I did research to find out which varieties were going to be best to make a hard cider. And that's what I grew. And then I've got a variety of other things. I just harvested 18 pounds of peaches for the
Nice.
first time on my peach tree. I've never had peach trees produce as much as they did this year for the very first time. And it goes back to that deep mulch and giving it time and actually creating an environment that was suitable for the trees. I've got a few apples. Next year I hope to have more. And it's just part of the journey, continuing to add things. I built a new bed, a 8 foot by 8 foot bed, which I normally don't do big square beds like that. I'm a big advocate of make it so you can work from all sides.
I
Uh, but
hear that.
but my initial plan for this 8 foot by 8, or I'd say 8 foot, it's actually closer to 6 feet, 6 feet by 6 feet, but um, is to maybe try blueberries, actually create a soil. And I experimented with this a little bit over the last couple years where I was growing blueberries in pots and they did okay. I created my own blueberry soil. The plants are doing okay. And so I'm actually thinking of enlarging that. And the reason I mention it is it's right in the middle of my little mini fruit orchard. So it's going to be trees, and then I've also got this raised bed that will have smaller fruit bushes inside of it that requires a different soil to be able to grow. And so am I working with nature or am I creating my own nature balance by doing some of this? I think it's a balance, and it can be argued a couple different ways. But I want variety, and I want all of those different things in that space. And then probably in a couple years, I'll move down a little bit and I'll put a sitting area because now the trees will be big enough that they'll be casting some shade. And so permaculture foundation, but overall it's all playing into the bigger scheme, which is I want something that looks good and produces some food.
Love it, dude. Yeah, the blueberries are acid loving, so they're definitely a little bit tricky, but the benefits can be amazing. I mean, I grew up in New England, so every summer we got fresh blueberry pie and cooked by my grandmother, and
Nice.
blueberry jam, and I miss that stuff so much.
Yeah.
I finally got lucky at a hardware store of all places. Found this. They brought in a line of these jams from New England, and one of them was the blueberry mix. And
Nice.
I've torn through probably 3 bottles in the last 6 months.
Nice. I'm a big jam and jelly maker, and last
Oh,
year
are you?
I made gooseberry. So last year I had a fantastic gooseberry harvest. I'd never tasted a gooseberry before, but I grew gooseberries so that I could make gooseberry jam. Fantastic. And then of course, aronia, the choke cherries, same thing. Choke cherry jelly is just amazing. And so a lot of what I grow, the fruits in particular, is to make jam and jelly out of them.
Nice, nice. And then
Yeah.
it gives you something to do in the winter, right?
Absolutely. And I'd love to be able to make a blueberry jam. I don't think I've ever had that, but I like the sound of
Oh,
it.
all right, all right. When we start trading boxes, I'll put one
There
of
you
them in
go.
there for you.
There you go.
You're going to be a changed man. You're going to be all about those blueberries next summer.
Awesome.
All right, cool. So yeah, I'm always interested in the way people approach like fruit trees. Ever since I was down in Puerto Rico, God, this must have been 20 years ago now, something crazy. I learned how when a couple gets married, they purchase a plot of land and they live with one of their parents for 5 years. And what they do is the
Okay.
first thing they do is they go out and plant fruit trees all around that property before they even start thinking about building a house. And then by the time they get done building the house and moving in, all of those fruit trees are producing. And I thought,
Yep.
wow, that's a great philosophy. And
Yeah.
so, it's one of those things that I'd love to share with people, especially who are thinking about, hey, you know what? I'm moving away from this traditional landscape. I want to get into more of an edible garden or 7-layer food forest, whatever you want to call it. But that's the start is those
Yeah.
trees, whether they're shade trees, fruit trees, or hedges to bring in the wildlife.
Yeah.
That's the foundation of it. So, I just had to ask because I'm really curious.
Well, and it does take time. So one of the reasons I developed that plan and actually put it on paper and then followed it is because I recognized it was going to take me many years to actually build a garden. I literally started with nothing but bare ground, and then have put in everything since then over the course of 5 years. But I measured out the entire space to include the center of my garden, and you can kind of see it over the my head here is the gazebo. I wanted the center of the garden to have a nice sitting space because I just love the birds and the bees and the butterflies and everything in this when you're in the center of your garden. And I wanted it to be surrounded by fruit bushes. And so 4 years ago, 3 and 4 years ago, I put in all of those fruit bushes, and last year is when I put in the gazebo. So those fruit bushes were actually in the ground growing for a couple years before I actually put the structure in place that those fruit bushes were designed to surround. And so most people are going to build the house and then plant the fruit trees,
Yeah.
or they're going to build the gazebo and then put in the fruit bushes, and they will have lost 4, 5, 6 years in the process. So, yeah, I wish I wish we would give fruit trees as wedding presents on a more
Right.
regular basis.
Right? Oh, birthday presents, Christmas
Yeah,
presents, whatever. Just it gets people excited, but also, hey, if you plant it now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, you're going to have an abundance from that tree. It's
yeah,
going to give you and give you and give you for the rest of your life. So I think that's a great suggestion. I think we should send out a e-blast to the whole world. Hey, when you're getting married, none of this china, none of this pots and pans. Give them trees.
yeah. It's fun. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, I talk about my mini orchard, but it's a line of 11 trees, five on each side with one kind of at the head of the space. But I've got trees throughout my landscape in the front yard and the backyard, apple trees, another peach tree that's in the middle of my pollinator garden, because it's all about that variety, and there needs to be different heights and different foliage and all around the garden. So it's the fruit trees to me are just another plant to put in the garden.
Yep, yep. It's about building structure,
Yeah,
right? That the trees are the structure of the garden. And I was always a big fan of shade trees too. I love the maples, the fast growing maples, or the not Carpinus, the London planes. Those things can explode in growth.
sure.
And again, they provide nesting area for the birds, and a place for you to hang, feeders or bird houses. So it's not necessarily like something that you can eat, but it's definitely a part of the structural overall garden that provides nesting and homes for other animals and predators.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to look pretty. I mentioned I had a couple trees that were mostly dead. Uh, I could have cut them down like most people would, because they'd look and go, "That tree looks terrible. It's mostly dead." Uh, but I left them in place because that's where I hang some of my bird feeders. It's a great location for the birds to hide from the hawks and the owls that are in my neighborhood. And they're not pretty trees, but they add a structure that I'm not able to get yet in all those younger trees.
Yep, yep. Again, and wind protection, right? That's another thing that people
Yep.
don't understand is that, especially these fast growing deciduous or conifers, that conifers work well as too, is to provide that wind barrier that is so important, that the early settlers, when we developed, especially out west and across the Midwest, they had rows and rows of these windbreaks, and now they've cut them all down to make more room for more crops. Now they got Tornado Alley because of what they did to that,
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of
and it
sad.
creates a place for the moisture to come off of the wind and drop down into the ground. I mean, there's just so many benefits to windscreen planting that is
Mhm.
not taken into consideration anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, fantastic. So we got a lot of questions. I normally
Yeah, let's
break,
get to some of the questions.
yeah, I normally break out at 1:30, but let's dive into it. And Ken, there was another one that I wanted you to tag. It was about tobacco. Super naso. Uh,
Super NASA.
yeah, NASA. You see it? If tobacco is not the tree of peace, just flag that one. We'll come back to it.
Okay, I'll do that. Well, I'll get you guys started, and then I'll search for that one. Right now, we got Dirt Right. Leighton, are you typically concerned about some of the? I'm not going to try to pronounce her. Right. Okay, looking filaments in the leaf mold.
All right. So the biggest piece of misinformation that's been circulated for a long time is that colorless, low diameter fungi that does not have septies are considered to be pathogenic. And that's not true. Saprophytic fungi take 7 to 10 days to show their morphology. So in the first 7 to 10 days, they have no color. They're very narrow diameter, and they don't have septies. So that would be, in the soil food web train of thought, well, that's a pathogen. But another thing that you have to understand is that, like everything in nature, is successional. So it moves along. Those guys, like yeasts and molds, are super important to provide the atmosphere, the environment, and the necessary soil structure for the saprophytes to come in. So think of them as foundational. If you pull up a diseased plant that is being attacked fungally, and you see tons of them, now you got a problem. Now you have a diseased one. But if you find some of those in your compost pile, and your compost pile is immature, no, chances are they're either saprophytes that have not shown their morphology yet, or they're the foundational fungi to build the environment up for the saprophytes. So don't freak out about it unless you just see miles and miles of the filaments.
Well, like he says here, I tend to believe that a lot of the clear hyphae are potentially just younger, underdeveloped fungi.
Yeah, again, if you're seeing like disease pressure and you're seeing a lot of them, then yeah, chances are that they are disease-causing fungi. But if you have good aerobes, if you're in an environment where you've got tons of protozoa, nematodes, and all of the other beneficial organisms, chances are that they'll either be food if they're pathogen, or they'll become mutualist, like in the case of Fusarium, or they're going to be beneficial. They're just immature.
Okay, and this one's for Scott. Do you do more mulching or more cover crops, or both?
All the above. So it depends. I have so many different gardening areas or different garden areas, and so in my perennial areas, in my fruit tree areas, I'm doing mulching, and I'm typically doing like a wood chip mulch. In my vegetable garden area and in those newer areas where I'm trying to develop the soil, I do cover crops. And depending on where it is, it affects the cover crop. So my soil, like I mentioned earlier, is compacted. It's really dense. And so daikon radishes I use as a cover crop to help break apart some of those areas. And then I'll follow that up with, some wheat variations or winter rye or winter peas or whatever it happens to be. In my vegetable garden area, I'll do the cover crops that are more of a green manure that I can actually turn into the soil as a soil biomass for the spring development of the soil. And then in other areas, depending on the transition time, I do both. So, like, I'll have mulch on my tomato plants and then recognize that because my season is so short, I need to get the cover crop growing while the tomato plants are still growing. So I'll have the tomato plants covered with mulch, and I'll put in different cover crop seeds to grow up through the mulch, so that by the end of the season, when the first frost hits and my tomatoes die, I just cut the tomato plants off at the base, leave the roots in the ground, and now the cover crops are already there in the mulch and growing out of the mulch to become biomass for next year's crop.
Talk about stacking functions. That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yep. So if you do meadow, how do you mow, if any?
All right. So in the case of the landscape architect, it was amazing. Even though this was a floral mix, a prairie mix, when you low mowed it, you couldn't tell the difference between the grass and the regular grass outside of the meadow and the path. It was amazing. And I tend to believe that some of the grass actually moved into those pathways as we kept them maintained low. But when it came to high mow, I actually welded on some stilts on a mulching mower that was like 18 inches off the ground. Then I had them use that to high mow it when things didn't look proper, like during the middle of the summer when you had dieback. But even at that, like you still had a little bit of like green that was happening in the stalks. It just you didn't have all the dead biomass. And so that was one thing. Another guy said he just set his weed whacker, a little bit higher and walk through it, which that tends to get a little ugly because you're going to get shit thrown at you, whereas the mower at least has a flap to prevent you from getting hit with stuff. But that's basically the way we accomplish that task.
Now, do you install birdhouses or other biology support structures?
Yeah, I've got birdhouses, and most of the birdhouses I have a couple generations, sometimes 2 or 3 generations over the course of the season. At the school garden, I think I mentioned I had a bat house, and I do want to put a bat house in this current garden. That's just on the list of things to do as we go through time. But I also do brush piles, and I try to have a number of different areas that the animals can get to depending on the animal. But primarily the birdhouses are easy because they're right there and you can see the birds coming in and you can hear the baby birds chirping as you walk by. But I think it's more than actually building a box structure. Even though a bat house might be a box structure, it's leaving some of those tall dead trees, and it's having that brush pile that might be a space for a young animal that needs to escape a predator. And so like most of the things in my garden, it's tiers of different things for different purposes.
Oh, that brush pile is a great idea.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ground nesting birds that
Exactly.
Right, that we don't understand or appreciate because we want to keep everything clean and cut and manicured. And how are they going to find home in that environment? So I applaud you for using brush.
And even some of the bees, a lot of the ground bees that we see on our flowers, but we don't understand that they actually are tunneling into the ground and creating a nest underground. They need that same kind of protection with leaves and brush to be able to have the the solitary bees that are not living in the colonies in a box.
And also the borer bees, right?
Yeah.
The bumblebees, and
Yeah.
there's a few different borer types. And again, that brush pile is an ideal home for them.
Mhm.
Really great idea. Really great idea. And yeah, with the bird boxes, are you targeting different types, like with different size schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I've only got one video on the birdhouses, and at some point I'll probably make more. But the opening and the size of the box varies on species of bird. So if you are trying to attract specific types of birds, you will vary the opening and you will vary the size of the box to attract those. And so I like the bluebirds that we have in Colorado. So I build boxes for the bluebirds. I've got kind of generic boxes for sparrows primarily. but they are different sizes with different openings so that different birds will find them.
Do you have a starling up there?
There is a starling. It's not a common bird, and I think it tends to be centered more around the city. You know, the way the starlings nest typically are like under underpasses or under overpasses or something like that.
Overhand. Yeah.
And we don't have a lot of those kind of areas in this part of Colorado, but I have seen some starlings like around the college in some of the older buildings and older structures that they have.
Yeah, barn swallows and starlings are really cool. I've
Yeah.
always been a big fan of them.
Yeah,
Like,
and it's those swallows that they're such a workhorse in the garden
mhm.
if you can attract them.
Yep, and that's how you attract them is you build like the fake eave off of a roof.
Yeah.
And that can be hung in a tree or hung off of a fence or whatever. But that creates that environment for them to come and nest. So that's why I brought it up because
Okay.
they are
Yeah.
an amazing workhorse.
Yeah.
Okay, Case Gilmore wants to know how long does it take an ecosystem to recover if it's still managed, such as agricultural system?
Wow. You want to start with that one?
Yeah. I don't think there's an easy answer to that because, and you might be speaking to this as well. A lot of it depends on the soil, and if the soil has basically been sterilized by big ag chemicals, it's going to take a while to get that soil alive again. If it's just big agriculture practices where it's monocropping for miles and miles and miles, it's like the cheese pizza again. You know, the soil may be okay, but there's no diversity or little diversity. And so the baseline of where you're starting, I think, is a factor as to how long it's going to take. But then the philosophy and how you do it. You know, we've been talking with how I do it, where I mix a lot and tried all these different layers. And I can build terrible soil into good soil in 3 or 4 years. And so theoretically, even on an agricultural level, you should be able to achieve some similar results.
So in my experience in the past when I was in Connecticut, I had an old time farmer who I met and at a conference about how to move the needle into a more organic and regenerative farming methodology. And he came up to me after I did my presentation. He said, "Hey, I just inherited a couple fields that are just so dead. I don't know what to do with it. Like I don't even want to bother farming it because it's dirt with a tiny little bit of grass here and there, but the rest is indicator plants or weeds, whatever you want to call them." And he goes, "Do you have an option for that?" I said, "Well, actually, I do. How big is it?" And he's like, "Oh, this one's 10 acres." And so I said, "Fine. You know what? Typically, I would charge this amount of money, but because you are a well-known hay farmer in the area and you have many fields, I'll treat the first one for you for free if you will, use my services in the future." So what we did was we went out there in spring, and I told him, I said, "All right, first of all, you've got to wet the field. Like, I just drive your water truck through here, get it moist, and then I want you to put down your seed. You've got to overseed this because we're not going to get anywhere." And so he wet the field and he overseeded it. And then I came in with my box truck and I sprayed into his tank sprayer. He has a boom spray, a not fully aerobic compost extract. And by that, I mean it was about 5 parts per million. So I had facultative anaerobes as well as aerobes, no anaerobes. We did one application, and the field came in the summer before, well before the cut. So this might have been early summer. We did another application of just food. So that was molasses, kelp, and humic acid. And he sprayed it again. And then in late August, he got his first cutting. Right after his first cutting, we came in and did another fully aerobic compost extract. And by that fall, he got a second cut. That field was night and day. It went from his worst producing field that he was scared to even waste money on to his highest performing field.
Wow.
And the craziest part was that everybody that bought the hay from the first cutting came back and were like, I need more, I need more, I need more. And he's like, well, why? You know, he's like, they're like, my horse's coats are just glossy and they're not jiggy. They're totally mellow. They're happy. Whatever that hay was, that was the best hay we ever got from you.
Wow.
And I was like, all right, now I got it. I'll get probably 10 more plots of 10 acres, you know, next spring. So we regenerated his dead dirt in one season.
Wow.
Again, it's not going to work in all situations.
Yeah.
Like Scott saying,
And it was a lot of work, but they were dealing with an expert who was able to put the right ingredients on.
Yeah, it dissolved organic matter, right? I didn't even know what I was doing back then, but that's essentially what I was doing, was installing that dissolved organic matter, liquid carbon, whatever you want to call it, that fuels the whole cycle of getting that soil back on its feet. And unfortunately, he ended up being forced into retirement due to some health issues, and his son-in-law came in and took over the operation and went back to chemistry. You know, I can't tell you how many times this has happened in my life, but you know,
That's too bad.
keep going. But it can be done relatively quickly with the right tools, the right intention, and the right equipment to apply it. I mean, you can't go out with a fire truck and spray biology. You're gonna just kill everything.
Yeah.
Okay. Case wants to know, do you feed your distraction plants?
Yes and no. So, you know, when I'm trying to keep deer away, then you know, the plants are typically going to be the native plants that the deer are naturally seeking. I don't do much about the soil. They just grow in whatever soil I put them in, which is terrible soil. So I'm not going to feed those plants because I want them to just grow and be eaten. For the plants closer to my garden area, I may amend the soil depending on where it is in relation to where the pest is coming from, because you're putting those plants between the pest entrance and your plants. And so if it's already an amended area, that's all I do. I don't feed my plants with really anything other than just focusing on the soil. So if it's going to be a long-term distraction plant, then yes, I will amend the soil and I will grow that plant on a regular basis just to keep the pest out. But if it's one of the temporary things because there's a pest coming in and I'm using it as a magnet plant to just get rid of the pest right then, I treat it like any other plant and I just water it and grow it in the sun, but I'm not fertilizing.
Well, you're growing the soil too.
Yeah.
So it's not fertilizing; it's creating fertility.
Exactly. Yeah, and yeah, it's one of those things. I'm not applying a synthetic chemical to help the plants grow. When I say I'm not applying fertilizer, that's what I'm referring to. But yes, absolutely, I'm creating nutrition.
Yeah.
By the process of focusing on the soil.
Do you ever use rock dust or organic meals or any of that stuff?
No, because my soil has enough minerals in it. You know, it's been tested. The mineral components of my soil are actually pretty good. It's just low in the macronutrients. And so when I fill my beds, I'm adding my own native soil to those beds. And there's enough mineral component to it. And so I don't see a need to add rock dust. I just add more of my sandy soil that has, and it's not all sand. I mean, it does have some clay particles to it. It does have some loam particles in it as well. And I've never had an issue with the plants deficient in anything that rock dust would give me.
Gotcha. Had to ask.
Sure. No, that's good. You know, and there's a lot of proponents of rock dust. Now, when I'm asked about rock dust, generally, I'll say for container gardening, I think rock dust has a purpose, because if you're growing in a soilless medium, there aren't going to be the building of the soil and the nutrients that the plants need. And rock dust, I think in that case is appropriate for people that are wondering why their plants aren't doing so well. Like a pot with a plant that's growing as a perennial. I think rock dust has a purpose there, but just generally in the vegetable garden, I don't see much purpose.
You know what I've been doing lately, Scott, is screwing around with clay in my compost pile.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing is incredible. I get these like sticky, gooey clay balls that are like blue in the middle, then there's a band of green and yellow and more taupey. So that is mineralization. That is,
you're creating aggregates with the mineral component. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do a post soon on Instagram. I've been busy lately, where I actually screened out some compost and I started taking these nuggets open and showing them and the colors, and it's really cool. It's been something I've been playing with the last 8 or 9 months because I didn't want to buy rock dust.
Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable, spending money, having it trucked in, and all of these other things when I have all this clay right around me.
Exactly.
And the clay is in a smaller particulate; it's going to bond easier and better. And so, so even in the container, just a handful of your local indigenous dirt is going to give you some of those.
And that's what I do. And I screen out the big sandy pieces and just put in the smaller clay and loam pieces, essentially in my containers for long-term planting.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah.
Great idea.
And you have less, another big issue, depending on how big the pot is, if it's nothing but organic matter, it's going to decompose and the surface layer is going to fall. And then before you know it, you've got a plant with a small root system because there's no soil, because it's sunk to the bottom. And so I also like to add real soil to my pots, just so I don't have as much sinking as the organics begin to break down.
Well, the next time you're on, we'll have to talk about the horizontal soil system, which I think you might find pretty intriguing.
Okay.
It's a layering system, basically mimicking nature, but
yeah,
that's a little bit more of a conversation than we have time for right now. But
yeah, well, I look forward to hearing about it, because if it's a layering system, then it sounds like something that I am all ears to hear more about, because it's back to that lazy smart gardening. It's like it's easier to add layers of all the ingredients and let all the organisms in the soil mix it for you than to actually try to make the effort to mix it yourself.
I have a landscape architect friend who does a lot of work in LA, and they have, it's all concrete and hills. So they don't have like a lot of area to do planting. So most of his work is in containers. And I turned him onto this system and he's like, oh my God, where have you been? Like, this is the easiest thing in the world. It holds the water. I don't have to water it nearly as much. The plant, that the soil doesn't sink, the surface doesn't go hydrophobic, which is another problem with potting soils, is that top dries out and forget it.
Yeah.
You put water on it, just runs off the side.
Yeah. Once it, and you talked about it earlier, once it becomes hydrophobic, whether it's compost or mulch or your soil in a pot, it's forever to try to get it back to the point that it actually holds onto the water again.
It's
that.
a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
Yep. Okay, so Case has another one here. What's the distance for cash crops versus the feed plot?
So, I don't really look at it as you need to separate them. And, it depends on what scale you might be talking about. But within the home garden in particular, the plants, as long as they have similar sun needs and similar water needs and similar nutrient needs, they can be growing in the same bed. And the whole concept of companion planting, I think, has really been misunderstood and misconstrued by so many people. I like to look at companion planting as just putting two different plants side by side that have similar needs, and they're going to benefit each other. one is going to attract something that the other probably needs, whether you know it or not. And you might discover that, the cash crop and the food crop growing side by side actually benefits both because of the insects that they're attracting, because of the predatory insects that one might attract that the other doesn't. And so I try to avoid the monocropping idea and segregating the plants I'm growing by either having, and I'll have all squash in one bed, or I'll have all peppers in one bed, but I've got the pepper bed right next to the squash bed. And all of the raised beds I'm growing are growing different plants in different quantities, because I think we really can benefit when we have plants growing close to each other. There just hasn't been enough research to say what those benefits are. I just see it when I'm growing the variety of plants, and they all do great.
So Scott, this is a trick you gotta try next year.
Okay.
Grow a super hot pepper in between 3 tomato plants.
I did that last year in my greenhouse.
Oh, you did? How
Yeah.
was it amazing tomato sauce or what?
So I grew, I had most success with Devil's Brain pepper, which is a 1.5 million Scoville.
Oh,
And I had it growing, or I had black cherry, a couple black cherry tomato plants growing right around it. And so, yeah, I did a video on that I was growing the super hot peppers, and I did a video on making pepper powder. But yeah, there's so many things I've done that I haven't done videos about, because it is just such a fun way to grow. I grew 10 different super hot peppers in my greenhouse, and I had 3 tomato plants growing in my greenhouse.
nice.
In the same, and again, in the same spot. My greenhouse, half my greenhouse is in the ground with amended soil. And so the super hots were growing side by side with the tomato plants.
Did you get that heat come over in the tomatoes or what?
No, there wasn't a transfer of the capsaicin in the peppers to the tomato plants. But when I harvested the tomatoes to make a salsa and used the peppers in the salsa, now you get that transfer of heat. Absolutely.
All right, so try like your stew tomatoes. A buddy of mine turned me on to this. He's a big gardener, grows all summer and then cans and reuses all the stuff that he grows in the garden during the summer. He's up in Vermont, so you talk about a short growing season. So he grew, like, I think it was Grim Reapers or something, in between 3 tomato plants, and that tomato sauce was amazing. It had like just the perfect amount of spice in it.
Interesting.
So there was some transfer there. And I don't know about all plants because, like you said, there's so much research that needs to be done to really better understand this. But there was definitely a transfer of the heat from that pepper into those stew tomatoes.
That's cool.
Yeah, yeah. And another big one is potatoes. Like, people don't understand. Like, potato is a great plant to put next to other plants because it's doing work in the ground and roots. And so you're getting there is a benefit for sure when you do this polyculture style growing, even if they're not totally compatible.
And I think too much gardening information or suggestions, tips, methods is based on the assumption that things are going to go wrong or that there's a problem in the garden. Because every gardener has heard that you're not supposed to plant potatoes next to tomatoes because they're both in the nightshade family and they will transfer disease back and forth to each other. Well, the assumption is that you've got a disease in your garden that's going to be transferred. And so I grow my garden with healthy soil and healthy plants to avoid diseases in the first place. And so growing tomatoes and potatoes in the same bed makes perfect sense because they have the same basic needs that those plants require. But people just don't do it because somebody told them that they're going to get disease if they do it. And so that's one of those things that just really annoys me that you operate under the assumption that everything's going to go wrong when you can grow peppers on top of your potatoes, and you can grow squash on top of your potatoes, and you can grow tomatoes on top of your potatoes.
I love it. Yeah, the fear mongering is the problem.
Yeah.
If you're living under fear, you're not going to take chances that might actually create something really unique and beautiful.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important what Leighton's doing, what you're doing, Scott, bringing information and knowledge out. I just want to just say I really appreciate what you're doing on your channel.
Thanks. I love doing it.
So Daryl Wright wanted to know, would a leaf mold wood chip blend be beneficial?
I think so. So one of the big reasons that I do wood chip mulch is so that the wood chips would break down and enrich the soil. And that is primarily being done by the fungi. And so a leaf mold, which was made with leaves, which are primarily being broken down by the fungal activity, if I mix those two, it's kind of giving a boost to the fungal activity that might not be as prevalent or present, and help those wood chips break down. So I'm using wood chip mulch so that the wood chips decompose and break down, and I think a blend would probably help that accelerate to a certain degree. If you're using the wood chip mulch because you want to have a cap on your soil and you're really not trying to get it to decompose, then the answer might be a little bit different, I suppose.
I agree with you. The combination of the fines and the coarse will definitely supercharge that whole process. You get more moisture pockets, you get more saprophytic action because the leaves are easier to chew than the chips. So yeah, you definitely speed up the process for sure.
Great more biology. Just getting more biology.
What a concept.
More diversity of biology from the different plant matter.
Yeah.
So we already asked that one.
We talked about that.
The one that you wanted me to save, if tobacco is not the tree of peace and was not smoked out of the peace pipe, why was it so sacred?
Well, that's a great question. The tobacco plant actually has a tremendous amount of medical benefits.
Yeah.
So it was revered as earth medicine. It was very precious and sacred. What they smoked in the peace pipe was actually called nick-nick. This was a combination of herbs and little nuts that they grind up and put together in a very sacred custom, and then they share that amongst each other. So when you sat down with a tribe, you would share your nick-nick with their nick-nick, and that was the peace pipe. But tobacco was medicinal, and the Indians were actually really kind of pissed at us for taking it and turning it into a recreational type of activity, kind of like a lot of things that we've done.
Okie dokie. So what, when you say turn in, does that include the roots, like a shallow till that was supposed to be?
Okay. Yes, but again, it depends. So I had mentioned that I do the cover crops in my tomato plants, and I cut the tomato plant off and leave the root in. When I turn it over, so that surface biomass, the green manure is in the soil, I try to do as deeply as possible. So it's a shallow till, about 5 inches maybe. I use a garden fork. But those big tomato roots are still big tomato roots, and they're going to interfere with the seed growth in spring. So while I've left those roots in place because of the benefit of the soil biome, I'll actually remove those big roots that haven't broken down in springtime, so that they're not interfering as a barrier to seeds that I might be planting. But the smaller roots and the less woody roots, I leave in the soil completely. So, if I'm chopping off lettuce or spinach or, something like that, and I'm leaving those roots in, when I turn it all over, some of those roots end up finding their way to the top of the soil, but I'll usually push them back into the soil as long as they're not woody and they look like they're going to break down in a relatively short period of time. And I like to do this, if I do it in the spring with a cover crop, I do it as early as I can, because I want a couple months of the soil development before I'm putting in any seeds or transplants. That's not enough time to break down the big mongrel tomato roots, but it's enough time to break down some of those smaller roots that were overwintering.
Carbon storage. Love it.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, that was it for questions, guys.
Okay.
Well, there was one more. Lily wanted Layton to talk to you about the horizontal soil system, but that'll have to be another show.
For next time. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'd love to have you come back on.
Oh yeah.
Like maybe this fall after you get through harvest, because I know it's probably going to start getting busy soon here. And you know, let's talk some more about this, because I really think that people as a whole need to hear more about the style that you're providing and this broader ecosystem of gardening than just gardening, because you're really you've incorporated nature, you've biomimicked it in a way that I
that's what I'm trying to do. So thanks for recognizing that, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
And I think you're probably the first guest that's taken it to the level that you have. So, you know, the audience, all audiences need to hear more about, you know, really kind of mindfully gardening, or, you know, at least appreciating that there is an ecosystem involved in gardening. Yeah. Because like you said, the more beneficials you can get in, the more birds you can get in, the more pollinators you can get in, the more diversity you create. And then it just expands out and out and out to your neighbors in the area around you. So big kudos, Scott. And, you know, again, thank you for all the energy and effort that you put into trying to educate people about, hey, you don't have to be a master. You can start with small little plot or a pot or whatever. Yeah. Just start.
Yeah. You know, I just happen to have gone through the Master Gardener program. None of this requires that you have Master Gardener certification. It's just a process that takes some time. And, you know, I think it helps that I can, you know, stand on my pulpit and say I was a Master Gardener, and that maybe that means people will listen a little bit more. But really, I'm just a gardener who has done these things over a period of time and seen that they work.
Well, and you can articulate.
Thanks. Yeah. That does make a difference.
Yeah, it always helps when you can actually, you know, get it out there where people understand what the heck you're talking about too.
Yeah. Well, I got a bunch of videos on the Gardener Scott channel that articulate many different aspects of gardening.
Yep. Beautiful. Well, Ken flashed it up a bunch of times. This is being recorded. We do have a pretty large following that doesn't always appear live. So hopefully you'll get some, some people that hit you up and thank you for the work that you're doing, because again, we really appreciate it. And,
well, I look forward to being back on sometime in the fall and carrying forward the horizontal system and whatever else happens to be the topic of the day.
Oh, we could go on for hours, my friend.
I know, I could talk gardening all day long.
Yep. So guys, for the Layton, do you have anything? Well, I know you have stuff coming up. Scott, we'll start with you. Do you have any live events you're doing, or do you do stuff like that?
So I do, excuse me, periodically. I don't have any events coming up. Most of that tends to happen in the springtime. But every Monday at 8 a.m. Pacific time, I have my own live stream. And I've been doing this for over 4 years now. And sometimes I have a guest. Most of the time during the growing season, it's me talking about whatever seems appropriate seasonally. And so that's live every week for me. And then the talks I'll do, or the classes I teach, you'll have to ask that again next spring.
Okay. And Layton, you've got some stuff coming up in California at Peach Hill, and I think another location as well, right?
So we have the second annual Baker Creek Heirloom Seed Festival, which is going to be a wonderful event this year. Last year there was only probably 2,000 people per day, but it had been on a hiatus for 3 years. COVID hit, they didn't do it. Then they didn't do it the next year, and then there was some misunderstandings or whatever, and they decided to bring it down to Ventura. But this year we're already just getting crushing it with people that are come out, display, talk. It's so bad that we had 2 stages, and Eric, the clerk of the works, just opened up another stage called the soil and compost stage, which is pretty much already full already, and this isn't for 2 weeks. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be there for 3 days with my box truck. I'll probably do some IG posts about it, as well as, I've got some wonderful speakers coming to talk, and maybe next year we can get you out here, Scott, to talk about that.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun. I actually visited the Missouri Baker Creek and got the behind the scenes look. I did a video on that tour, and so I've wanted to go to California to see the other half of the Baker Creek as well.
Well, next year for sure. Well, hey, if you can, you're welcome to friggin' jet out here. I mean, I could definitely get you tickets, parking, whatever else is needed.
Nice. Well, we'll have to stay in touch and consider that as an option.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. And then lastly, we have an event at Peach Hill Soils. We're doing the final put together tomorrow morning at 9, but it looks like we're going to have a lunch and learn for professionals on Friday, and then an open house on Saturday. There'll be workshops, as well as stuff for kids to do some planting, rock painting.
Cool.
That'll be another fun event coming up on November 1st and 2nd.
Cool. So, guys, if anybody's in California, you know where you can meet up with Leighton. As for the channel, of course, we've got Andy Lopez, the Invisible Gardener, and myself on Wednesday. And then on Friday, I have Linda from Another Time coming on, another homesteader. So you guys are going to want to check that out on Friday. And we'll see who we got next Monday with Leighton. But anyway, guys, we'll end it there. So say peace out, guys, and we'll talk to everybody later.
Great being here. Had a great time.
Thank you so much for this time. Really appreciate you coming on and giving us 2 hours. Ken, as always, thank you for